Morning. Happy Sabbath. I am wired and ready to go. Praise the Lord for that special music. Amen? Amen. I thoroughly enjoyed that. All right. I suppose I should pray before we start. So let's bow our heads. Father in heaven, we're now about to open your word and read some events that took place while your Son walked this earth. No one came to hear a man, Lord. They came to hear you speak through your word. And so remove the distractions that plague each one of us this morning, that we might have clear revelations of you and what you require of us. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, the sermon this morning is called That Was Awkward. Any of you ever say that before? I say that. It's usually when I do something bad and awkward. And I say it under my breath after it happened. But anyway, we're going to look at an awkward story for someone in the Bible today. First, I want to read this old quote I found in a magazine. It says, "It's harder to reach the hearts of men today than it was 20 years ago." And this was written a really long time ago. "The most convincing arguments may be presented, and yet sinners seem as far from salvation as ever." Anyone ever feel like that's true? You just proof text somebody to death and they just don't get it? "Ministers should not preach sermon after sermon on doctrinal subjects alone. Practical godliness should find a place in every discourse." So I hope in this sermon this morning that you find something practical that you could apply to your lives even today, even after this sermon is over. And so I appreciated really, if you were here for Sabbath school, at the end we got real practical. And I like practical things. So forgive me if I'm ever impractical. Hold me accountable to that. But we're going to look at a story this morning that is found in 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And it must be found in 3 of them because it stood out in the apostles' minds quite distinctly, this story, because 3 of them repeat it, and they write it down for us. And if any of you are taking notes, it's found in Matthew 9, verses 1 through 8. Don't turn there. Mark 2, verses 1 through 12. And Luke 5, 16 through 26. And we're going to be looking at Mark's narrative. So if you want to turn to Mark chapter 2, Mark includes some interesting details in his account. And there's a reason, which we'll find out in just a few minutes, why he adds some interesting details that maybe the others wouldn't have caught. This is the story of Jesus healing the man with palsy, and where his friends let him down through the roof where Jesus is preaching. Now, how many of you have heard that story? Okay, almost everyone. If you read through the Bible, or even through the New Testament, you would have read it 3 different times. It's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, so it's a very popular story. And we're going to look at what kind of applications can we make for us today. So let's start in Mark chapter 2 and verse 1. Are we all there? "And again he entered into Capernaum after some days, and it was noised that he was in the house." Mark here says Jesus entered into Capernaum and he was in the house. Like we should know what house Jesus just entered into. If we look back in Mark chapter 1, we can find out whose house he was in. In Mark chapter 1, beginning in verse 21, Jesus has just called 4 disciples, 4 fishermen, Andrew, Simon, James, and John. And it says in verse 21, "And they went into Capernaum." How do we say that? Does anyone know? Capernaum? How do you say it? Capernaum? All right, I'll use that. "And they went into Capernaum, and straightway on the Sabbath day he entered into the synagogue and taught." So here, Jesus goes into Capernaum, which is where he's at in Mark chapter 2. And he's preaching in the synagogue. He casts out a demon there. Skip down to verse 29. "And forthwith, when they were come out of the synagogue, they entered into the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. But Peter's mom is sick there." And why is she sick? What does she have? She's got a fever. So Jesus comes in and he heals her. The fever leaves her and she ministers to them. Verse 32. "And at even, when the sun did set, In other words, after Sabbath, because Jesus was preaching in the temple, Sabbath is over, and it says in verse 32, they brought unto him all that were diseased and them that were possessed with devils, and all the city was gathered together at the door of whose house? Simon and Andrew, Simon Peter, Simon and Andrew's house. So the whole city is outside of Peter's house, and Jesus is healing everyone that's coming who's sick. It says, and he healed many that were sick of diverse diseases, cast out many devils, and suffered not the devils to speak, because they knew him. And so in the morning, Jesus gets up, as was his custom, and he goes out to do what? Verse 35. He's praying. And Simon, or Peter, comes, and he says, hey, everybody that was here, they're all looking for you again. And Jesus says, let's go to the next towns so I can preach also over there. That's why I came. I didn't come to just preach here in Capernaum. So he goes on this preaching tour all around to the other cities. And during this time, you remember the story of Jesus going in the boat over to the land of the Gergesenes, where the two demoniacs come running out of the tombs. And all the disciples take off running down the beach, and Jesus is standing there, and he casts out the demons. And he casts them out into the pigs. Does anyone remember the story? All the pigs run down into the water. And so then the whole town comes out, and they're like, Jesus, we would like to ask you to leave, because that was some of our wealth that just got drowned in the ocean. So Jesus obliges their request, and he leaves. And then we get to chapter 2, and it says, and again he entered into Capernaum, and after some days it was noised that he was in the house. So he's back in Peter's house here in Mark chapter 2. And we'll keep reading in verse 2. And it says, and straightway, or immediately, many were gathered together, insomuch that there was no room to receive them, no, not so much as about the door. Mark is painting a picture. He's trying to get you to visualize the scene. This is a poor fisherman's house. The last time Jesus was there, the whole city came out to him. It was like a scene out of a horror movie, right? People limping down the road, people possessed with devils. Maybe they were foaming at the mouth, thrashing about wildly. They're hobbling on crutches to get to Peter's house. This is the scene last time, and now Mark is saying it's like that again. And there's so many people you can't even get to the door of Peter's house. It's just jammed. This is like the main event in Capernaum. And Luke here gives an interesting fact that Mark leaves out. And it was our scripture reading, so just hold your finger there and flip back over to Luke chapter 5. It was Luke 5:17. Mark said, straight away, there were so many people, you couldn't even get near the door. And here Luke, talking about the same event, says in Luke 5:17, and it came to pass on a certain day as he was teaching, that there were Pharisees and doctors of the law sitting by, which were come out of every town of Galilee and Judea and Jerusalem, and the power of the Lord was present to heal them. Now this is very interesting to me. How many other times do you think that Peter had the Pharisees and the teachers of the law and the scribes over to his house for lunch? How many times? Probably never, right? But they're all crowding around. So many of them that you can't even get near the door of his house. And an interesting thing that Luke says here is they came out of all of Galilee, all out of Judea, all out of Jerusalem. They all want to see this new evangelist, Jesus, coming into town. What's this guy saying? What's he doing? We heard last time he was here that he healed all of these sick people who came to the door. That was pretty impressive. I'm sure that was the talk of the town for quite some time. Probably many people still looking for Jesus after he left. And now he's back. And now the leaders, the religious leaders, come out to hear him. And it says the power of the Lord was present to heal what? Them. Interesting. Present to heal who? In the context, it looks like it's the Pharisees, the doctors of the law sitting by, all these people that were there present. Now, what other types of people would have been present at this home church meeting? If you think about people all coming out of the city to Peter's house, you can tell me, what other types of people would have been present other than doctors and Pharisees and teachers of the law? Sick people? Sure, heard what happened last time and they wanted to come. What other kind of people?
Prostitutes.
Prostitutes? Sure. What other kind of people? Curious people, absolutely. Wouldn't we all have been there just for curiosity's sake? What else? Hungry people? Okay, maybe they thought Peter was going to feed them at their house. What else? Think there were some rich people there? Maybe some poor people? Maybe some people of different nationalities? Just think about everyone in the city coming out to your house. It would be quite a melting pot of people, wouldn't it? It would be pretty neat to be at that event. All right, flip back over to Mark chapter 2. Mark is just trying to paint this picture that the city is come out to see Jesus. There are teachers of the law, the religious leaders are there, the disciples are there, Peter's family is probably there. Curious people, people who don't really care, people trying to be religious, and it's just packed. And we'll continue in verse 3. Mark chapter 2 and verse 3. And they come unto him, bringing one sick of the palsy, which was born of 4. In modern English, it would say that 4 men brought to Jesus a man with palsy. Now, what is palsy? What is it? Someone said paralysis over here, very quietly. Yeah, what's paralysis? Are there any doctors? I was talking to some students in doctoring. Okay, you usually lose like feeling, I think, in that limb, and then you can't move it anymore. You're paralyzed. So this guy had lost some feeling and some movement in his limbs. That's why he had to be carried there by these 4 men. So I imagine that they're probably taking him on some type of mat or like a blanket, and the 4 guys got on 4 corners and they lifted it up, and they're carrying him to Jesus. Okay? Verse 4. And when they could not come nigh unto him for the press. What's the press? The crowd. So these 4 men are carrying the paralytic to Jesus. They can't get near him for the crowd. It says they uncovered the roof where he was. When they had broken it up, they let down the bed wherein the sick of the palsy lay. Now it's interesting, if you read Matthew's account of this story, Matthew just says that 4 men brought a paralyzed man to Jesus. Luke says that these 4 men uncovered the tiling of the house and they let down a sick man to Jesus. But here Mark says when they couldn't get near him, it says they uncovered the roof where he was, and when they had broken it up. In other words, when they ripped off the roof, they let the guy down into this little room where Jesus was preaching. Now, why is that interesting that Mark includes that detail? Whose house were they at? Peter's house. Does anyone know who told Mark what to write in his gospel? Peter did, right? So Peter here is giving the first-hand account of what happened. Peter's saying, they came to my house. I'm sure they tried to get into the front door. They must have tried that first. And they were carrying him, and they probably started weaving through. You know how you do in a crowd? And you just get to a point where you can't get any further. Like, I can squeeze, I'm a slim guy, wiggle through. But I imagine if there was someone across from me, and there was 4 of us carrying a big litter with a guy on it. We don't know how big or small he was, but still is a grown man, right? That they can't weave and bob through the crowd very well. And so that doesn't work, so they're like, hey, maybe we should try around the left side. And so they go around the left side, same thing. Maybe we should try it around back. Like, these are thoughts going through the guys' heads, right? They're obviously trying to get to Jesus. How are we going to do it? They can't get near him. And then someone comes up with the absurd idea, we'll lift this guy onto the roof. And then we'll rip off the top of the roof of this guy's house. We're not really sure whose house it is, right? Maybe they didn't know. And we'll let him down right through the roof. And somehow, all 5 of them said, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's do that. And that's what they do. And so, they climb on top of the roof, which I imagine was quite a feat of strength in and of itself, to to lift a guy up onto a roof. The houses, I did a little bit of research and found that the houses were probably 6.5 to 8 feet high back then. And the walls would be built of stone, and then when they would get to the roof, they would lay timbers across these stone walls. And depending on how wealthy you are, that would determine how close the timbers were to each other. So they said they were usually about the width of a man apart. They would lay these timbers, and the timbers would stick out the sides. And they would paint those with tar, so they wouldn't decompose out in the elements. In Bolivia, when they would build their houses, they would paint the bottom of the sticks with diesel fuel, put them in the ground, and fill in the ground, the soil and things around it, so the timbers wouldn't rot. Well, they painted it with tar, anyhow. They would lay these timbers across. To make the roof, they would lay reeds bound together across the timbers, and on top of that would be a layer of mud plaster, then a dry mixture of chalk, earth, and ash for insulation. When we were in South America, we had a roof that was made of leaves, and we would tie them together really tight. I actually built a gazebo that was made out of these reeds, and they're very particular about how they look. They can make it look very nice, where the seam where you bind them together is behind like the timbers, so it looks very even and nice. And it works very well for keeping the water out. And then they put this mud mixture on top of all of these other layers, and then they would take a big stone and they would roll it on top of the roof to make it all flatten out and even, so it was a nice, like a 3-inch thick layer of this mud and plaster on top of these reeds for the roof. So the guys get up there on the roof, and I think it was common back then for people to go onto the roof. You remember in Acts, Peter's up on the roof of someone's house, and he's up there doing what? What? Praying, right? He's hungry. He goes up there to pray to get his mind off the food. And so he's walking around on the roof, so I'm assuming that was somewhat common. So they climb up this ladder with this paralyzed man. They get him onto the roof. And I imagine that Jesus is inside preaching. And I don't know if any of you have been in your house when someone's been on the roof, but you can usually hear what's going on your roof, right? Through this ice storm, Carrie and I were sitting down, we were eating, and I think Carrie had some music playing. We kept hearing this noise. I'm like, what is that noise? And it was just like this whoosh, 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 kept going. And we finally figured out that the ice had come down. You know that little thing on your house that spins around, like on the roof? I don't know what that is. A what? Windmill? Wind thingy. And anyway, the ice had collected on it, so it was kind of like scraping as it was going around. And we could hear that sitting there at our table. We finally figured out what it was. So I imagine with 5 grown men on top of the building, the people inside could hear something was up on the roof. And I imagine if there's so many people in the house and outside the house, all listening to a man speak without all this technology, they were probably trying to be really quiet so everybody could hear, right? They're all, shh, shh, I'm trying to hear Jesus. And they hear this stomping around on the roof. And I imagine as Jesus is speaking that maybe a little dust starts falling down. And then maybe a little bit more. And maybe it starts falling on the people sitting around him. You know, sometimes we say that there's standing room only in places. It's probably something like that. Maybe they're sitting. I imagine that probably the disciples are close to him. And then the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, because they like to be at the first place at the feast, they're probably like right there too. And probably a little dust starts falling on them too. And pretty soon, I imagine that Jesus has to stop. It's like the elephant in the room, right? Everyone's looking at it, and they're not paying attention to Jesus anymore. These men start pounding on the roof, trying to bust it open, is what Mark says. They broke it up. And so I imagine Jesus probably just stops because everyone's looking over his head, and maybe a stick just comes, punctures straight through the roof. Maybe it's one of the guy's feet. Comes just right into the room. I mean, think about it. How did they bust up the roof while Jesus is preaching? They reach their hands in, and you just see him start ripping the roof off. What is Peter thinking? What are they doing to my house? Maybe they're a little apprehensive. Jesus is preaching, we're all here, somebody's coming in through the roof, like aerial assault. What's going on? And then I want you to think about how big of a hole did they have to make to let down a paralyzed man on a mat. We're not talking about like a little manhole, right, where we can drop him down, hands, and he'll land on his feet. Like, they had to lower him down inside the house. So I imagine this probably took a little while. And finally, the guy is dropped down through this gaping hole in the roof. And I imagine it was packed inside, so maybe some people jumped up to get out of the way. Maybe they didn't have time. And, I think the disciples were probably sitting around Jesus, the Pharisees and teachers of the law. And maybe this guy gets dropped right in the lap of a Pharisee. Do you ever think about that? Maybe he gets dropped right in the lap of a scribe. Boom. There's this paralyzed guy sitting in your lap while Jesus is preaching. If nobody could get near the door, I imagine they couldn't get anybody else inside, so they probably couldn't move very far, wherever he came down. That must have been awkward, to be that guy. How did the Jews view someone who was sick? Cursed, right? A sinner. In John chapter 9, if you want to just hold your finger here, there's a story where we know that's true. In John chapter 9, verse 1, the disciples and Jesus are walking around in John chapter 9, and they pass by this guy who is blind. It says, and as Jesus passed by, he saw a man which was blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Because the most blessed Jews are healthy, wealthy Jews, right? They're not sinning. But, Lord, who sinned that caused him to be blind? And Jesus said, neither has this man sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in his life. Jesus is saying, well, neither of them sinned in particular. He lives in a sinful world. But I've come to give deliverance from sin. I can heal him from that sin, and it can be for my glory. That I come to reveal the power of God to save from sin through healing him. And you can all see that. Now, can sickness be a result of sin? Give me an example. Okay, specific example. Too much sugar could lead me to have a compromised immune system and get like the cold or something like that. Okay. Smoking. If I smoke, then what's going to happen? Okay, I could get lung cancer. Absolutely. Okay, excellent. Now, do you think someone who we'll use cirrhosis of the liver. Cirrhosis of the liver or AIDS, do you think that they usually know what sin it was that brought that disease on them? If I have lung cancer and I smoke, do I make the assumption that my smoking caused my lung cancer, wasn't from breathing fresh air, exercising outside? Right? So usually these people know when their sin causes their sickness, right? So that does happen. And in Mark chapter 2, I believe that judging from Jesus' reaction to the man being dropped right in front of him, that this man's palsy had been brought on by a life of sin. And so let's read Jesus' reaction here. It says in verse 5, the guy just gets dropped down after they've ripped open the roof in Peter's house. He's let down. And Jesus, first thing he says, when Jesus saw their faith, he said unto the sick of the palsy, Son, thy sins be forgiven thee. Why else would Jesus say, thy sins be forgiven thee, if that wasn't something the man was struggling with, right? He knew that his sins had brought this sickness upon him. And so Jesus addresses this man's most urgent need first. And I love the way that Jesus starts his sentence. What's the first word he says there? Son. In Matthew Matthew says, "Son, be of good cheer." The word son literally translated means my son or my child. Be of good cheer. And I love the way that Jesus says that. And he follows it with, "Your sins are forgiven." Praise God. That in this awkward situation where a sinful man in all of his brokenness and sinfulness, in his very visible palsy, dropped right in the lap of the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, who don't contaminate themselves with sin, Jesus says, "My son, be of good cheer, your sins are forgiven." Think about the gravity of the situation that this guy gets dropped into. Very interesting dynamics in the room. This man, in all of his sinful, broken self, shameful, just comes right to Jesus. And what's interesting in verse 5 of Mark chapter 2, it says, when Jesus saw their faith, he forgives the man of his sins. It doesn't say when Jesus saw his faith. It says when he saw their faith. Who was the they, the there? The four men who took him to Jesus, right? And he says, because of all of your faith, your sins are forgiven. Do you have faith that Jesus can heal people just the way that they are? In all their brokenness, in all their shame, that Jesus can forgive them? Would you go to awkward and extreme lengths to bring someone to Jesus like these four guys did? You think that was awkward getting him to Jesus? Yeah. Everyone looked on this man like he was cursed of God. The curse of God is resting on him. That's why he's paralyzed. And they stop at nothing, going to the lengths of ripping open someone else's roof just to get him in front of Jesus. The paralytic is helpless, right? He can't get to Jesus himself. He has to have someone take him. And unfortunately, when they do take him to Jesus, sometimes we think this is going to be an easy road. I'm going to bring this guy right to Jesus. But when they get to where Jesus is, there's so many Pharisees, there's so many church members in the way that they can't even see Jesus. So I have a question for you today. Would it be safe for Jesus to drop a sick person into this church? Would it be safe for Jesus to drop a sick person in the chair next to you, or even in your lap in church this morning? It's a heavy thought. It happened once, right through the roof. And we can say, yeah, I can tell them all about hydrotherapy. I can get some circulation back in those legs, right? But what if we said, would it be safe for Jesus to drop someone struggling with pornography into the seat next to you? Would it be safe for Jesus to drop someone struggling with homosexuality in the seat next to you, and they told you that? Would it be safe for Jesus to drop someone who just went through a divorce at another church next to you? What would your reaction be? Would you have accepted the man in his physical and spiritual brokenness just the way that he was, right there in your lap? Or maybe you just said, brother, we need to start with a health lecture. You've been staying out late at night. You've been eating 4 meals a day. You haven't been getting out in the sunshine. And if you hadn't done those things, you wouldn't be in this condition. Does Jesus start with those things? Does the man need any more conviction of sin at this point? No. That's why he came to Jesus. There are some things, believe it or not, that a vegan diet, hydrotherapy, massage, stitches, a shot, crutches won't fix, right? This man needed the assurance of forgiveness. Some people need to know that God forgives them and accepts them just the way they are before we tell them anything else. It's just like this block that I can't hear anything else you're saying until I know I'm forgiven. So this morning, maybe you're like the man trying to get to Jesus, and you feel the way is difficult. There's people in the way. Don't stop at anything. This man went to extreme lengths to get in front of Jesus, and the reward was huge. Don't stop at anything. And there are two classes that I want to bring out from this story. There's a class of people that hinders the man from getting to Jesus, that wouldn't let him get through, that looked on him like a sinner. And there's another class that would stop at nothing to bring this man to Jesus, the four friends. There are people who agonize over their children, who agonize over their parents, their friends, someone they love, trying to get them into church. Any of you ever had that agony before? You want them to know Jesus. And usually, at least this is my thought, you got one chance, right? If I could just get them there one time, hopefully everything will go perfect. And usually one of two scenarios play out, okay? Let's role play for a minute. They get to church, and they're not wearing a suit. They have jewelry on. They don't have a wide margin Cambridge edition KJV Bible in their hand. And their friends don't care, and their family doesn't care. They're just excited that they're in church. Amen? And they're apprehensive at the same time, just hoping nobody's going to blow it. Any of you ever been there before? I've been there. You know what I'm talking about. Many of you probably didn't invite someone to church today because you were afraid somebody was going to blow it when they came. I've been there. And no one greets this person with full-on frontal hug at the door. I'm talking about one after the other. A few handshakes and some happy Sabbaths, and who in the world knows what that means anyway? And they come and sit down. No one invites them to their home after church. No one sits at their table for potluck, but at least they heard a present truth sermon filled with lots of proof texts. Scenario number one. Does that happen? Hopefully not. Okay, second scenario. I've been in both these scenarios, so maybe I'm unique. They get to church. They're greeted with full-on hugs at the door. They can barely get to their seat. They feel like everyone's invaded their personal space. And they don't mind, right? And 3 families invite them over to their house for lunch that day. They get invited to multiple social events that week at their house. No one notices they're not wearing a suit or jewelry because that's how everyone else in the congregation is dressed. No one notices that they don't have a Bible because the pastor only uses his for 1 or 2 scriptures on grace. Are you following me? In Luke, in our scripture reading, it said that the power of the Lord was present to what? Heal them. And in Mark chapter 2, let's read it one more time, in verse 2, it says, "Straightway many were gathered together, insomuch that there was no room to receive them, no, not so much as about the door. And he, Jesus, preached" what? "The word unto them." The power of the Lord that was present to heal them was through his word. Through the preaching and teaching of God's word, there is power to heal people. God's word has creative power. When he told the man that his sins were forgiven, it was impossible for him to lie. When he told the man to stand up and walk, instantly blood started flowing to those paralyzed limbs. The muscles grew, they grabbed hold of the bones, and he stood up. It's impossible for God to lie. His word has creative power, and it needs to go forth with power. When I read this story here in Mark chapter 2, I see a third scenario played out that rarely is witnessed, in my opinion, in church today, where this palsied, sick man in all of his sins is dropped very awkwardly into this home church in Peter's house. And Jesus welcomes him so cheerfully. Son, my child, be of good cheer. And he walks out of this church changed spiritually and physically. He's healed. That's power that this man experienced in church. Church should be a place where you come as you are, right? Broken, messed up, sinful. Someone said this morning, church should be like a hospital. It was like a hospital for these people. And you're changed by the teaching and preaching of God's Word. People, though, don't need to just hear about Jesus. They need to see Jesus in you and I. In every one of us when they come in this door. They need to come all messed up and broken, but then they need to know that God has power to change their lives, so they don't have to leave like that. So the question I have for you today is, do people see Jesus reflected in you and I when they come? Are you carrying the sick to Jesus so that they can be changed by him, refusing to stop at anything, going to any lengths to get someone in front of Jesus like these guys, 4 friends? Or are you like the crowd, like the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, preventing somebody from getting to Jesus, from seeing him, from hearing him? My prayer is that we'd all be like these men's 4 friends, stopping at nothing to get the sick in front of Jesus. Let's all pray and search our hearts and ask the Lord, what is there in me that would prevent someone from coming to know Jesus? We shouldn't have to sacrifice truth for love or love for truth, right? God is truth and he is love. So let's all seek the Lord how we might implement that in our own lives and in our own time at church.